Welcome back to the Naughty Corner. Today we're going to wrap up our series investigating the findings of the Independent Police Conduct Authority's report about police actions during the Convoy 2022 protest at Parliament. The first three of the report's brief, 5-paragraph long concluding assessment section sets a very reasonable tone, especially paragraph 937, which reads as follows. We pointed throughout this report to several areas where decision making fell short of the ideal, and police might have done things differently and achieved better results. But in view of the significance of the event, its location, and the demands it placed upon police individually and as an organisation, it is also important that we set out our overall assessment of the police response and whether it served the community well. Then, 217 pages deep, 4 paragraphs into the section, it leaps straight into the ultimate conclusion of this entire endeavour. In this respect, we've concluded that police generally did a good job of managing the protest and bringing it to an end, especially in light of the challenges faced in dealing with the impact of COVID-19 on their staff resource and with other protests happening around the country at the same time. Police leadership acted independently and without undue political intervention. They set clear expectations about the need for officers to exercise professionalism and restraint. Almost all officers, with remarkably few exceptions, met or exceeded these expectations. Justification for this judgment is then imported by pointing towards the events of late day March the 2nd, a period of time for which the authority barely received any complaints. That was particularly evident on the 2nd of March when they had to endure extreme provocation and violent behaviour from some militant protesters, and sometimes lacked equipment and had to respond to last-minute changes of plan. So there you go, those who review police conduct for a living say it was justified. Who are we to say otherwise? Cue the zealous parroting of every legacy media outlet the length of this country within hours of this verdict's release. In the last paragraph before progressing into recommendations, the following is written, which I assume is to further justification. We received 1,905 complaints, but most of these were from people who were not at the protest. Although this was a 3-week event involving protesters estimated at times to be in the thousands, we received only 84 complaints from individuals who were physically present at the protest. After close assessment, we independently investigated 19 of these complaints, and our preliminary findings are that police actions were unjustified in 8 cases. That is a remarkable outcome, especially given the violence that degenerated into what was effectively a riot on the final day. The problem is the IPCA investigation found 8 instances of unjustified conduct on behalf of police, contrasted with the mention of only 1 assault charge by protesters recorded in the report. Let's say they investigated all 84 complaints and the same 42% guilty ratio held. There could be as much as 35 instances of unjustified action from the police versus 1 assault charge against protesters. Given assessment doesn't seem to be their strong suit, perhaps their findings are wrong. It could be 84-1 for all we know, and I wouldn't be surprised. Remember, the 1 violent charge against protesters hasn't had its verdict resolved by the courts yet either. Anyway, they then move on from their conclusions to recommendations, and what it seems they really want to talk about, expansions to legal powers. In paragraph 966, the report lays out a number of bullet points for 3 main areas of policing legislation they'd like to see changed: trespass, mass arrest and seizure. I'll group these, quoting directly from the recommendations section, though often abridged, and include other spots in the report they have promoted. Firstly, trespass laws, as stated in the recommendations. The somewhat arcane law on trespass, with its requirements for 2 separate warnings and its distinction between a Section 3 warning and a Section 4 warning, is clearly orientated towards single individuals or small groups and is ill-suited as a means of managing a large-scale event in a public or quasi-public place. This sentiment is first mentioned in paragraph 25 of the executive summary, and then again in paragraph 321 discussing February 10th, where it suggests perhaps a different approach to public order policing in these situations that does not depend on the law of trespass needs to be developed. Not a change in trespass law for all Kiwis, just for government enforcement. Then, there is the recommendation for mass arrest laws, as follows. There are significant evidential difficulties in proving there has been a lawful arrest in a volatile mass arrest situation where individual arresting officers may be handing arrested persons over to others while they continue to manage the resisting crowd on the front line. Advised in paragraph 333 of the section covering February 10th, it is repeated almost word for word later in paragraph 867 as the report covers the 2nd of March events. The law of arrest is largely predicated on the assumption the process is a one-on-one interaction. It is ill-equipped to deal with volatile crowd control in public order situations. That means you won't need to have committed an offence yourself, simply be part or identified as part of a group or association worthy of apprehension. Lastly, seizure laws, and this section is abridged considerably for brevity's sake, but all of this is in paragraph 966 if you want to read it yourself. Spoiler alert if you do, because you'll find the following. While police and local authorities have adequate powers to close roads, the powers to seize vehicles are more limited and inadequate to deal with a blockade situation. nor is there any specific provision dictating what enforcement officers or indeed private citizens should do with property that a protester brings or leaves on a property. This is a lacuna in the law that gives rise to uncertainty and potential civil liability by those dealing with it. First arcane trespass laws, now lacuna. Somebody had their thesaurus out, almost as if they knew these final verdicts would be the only part of the report to be read. It's certainly written in a way that appears erudite compared to the body of the report, the type of thing to make politicians nod, media cheer, and the public clap like seals. Anyway, lacuna means gap, but this isn't a gap in the law. You're not supposed to be able to meddle with a citizen's belongings on private property, whether they're a protester or not. The desire of this government that you own nothing and them everything is a topic for another day though, so let's continue. The power to remove property from roads and other public places from which persons have been trespassed is also limited to specified individuals, a cumbersome and unnecessary process. This is first brought up in paragraph 54 of the Executive Summary, and fleshed out in paragraph 933 in the section discussing the destruction of protesters' property. It then goes on to mention in the following paragraph that a member's bill called the Local Government Freedom of Access Amendment Bill was proposed in 2017 but failed at its first reading. The bill had advocated similar ideas and was introduced at the start of Labour's first term. I find this interestingly prophetic as Labour, sitting in control of Parliament in its last 2 terms, has seen the most protests of any government by a significant margin. Having some more legal powers in place to help quell the civil unrest sure would have been helpful. Don't worry though, they just introduced the Criminal Activities Intervention Bill right before government closed its term. How fortunate! This one already passed its first reading and allegedly grants powers to the police to act against vehicles travelling together in a convoy of 2 or more that are intimidating or disrupting the public. I say allegedly because I went to legislation.gov.nz to read the bill, but there were no details recorded for this section of the document. I'm not sure why this was needed, given that police could already act against vehicles of 2 or more or less that were breaking the law. The only real addition is the vagary of pliable terms such as intimidating or disrupting. I mean, by nature protests are meant to disrupt, but I'm sure this won't be used to infringe upon our right to do that. Anyway, there you go, that's effectively the end of the IPCA report. The final sentence reads, "But despite the range of recommendations for change we have made, we believe that in dealing with this difficult and complex set of events, police serve the public of New Zealand well." It's then signed off by Judge Colin Doherty, Chair of the Independent Police Conduct Authority. I'm less inclined than Judge Doherty to believe that police serve the New Zealand public well. The government perhaps, but not the public. Maybe I was just feeling a little worn out from all the protecting and serving the protesters received over those 23 days. We'll get to that shortly. But first, having finally wrapped up a fairly long breakdown of the IPCA report, let's do a report of our own on their report. First category, information gathering and methodology. We all have our biases, but this report almost wore theirs on its sleeve like a badge of honour. There was clearly preferential treatment both regarding the sourcing numbers involved and the courtesies one side received. While the police conduct was defended in the face of any evidence, many damning cases were made against the protesters throughout its pages without supporting evidence being included in the documentation. Worst of all, a citizen's OIA request found there had been communication and pressure between politicians and police via Whatapp. The report spent over 3 pages telling us this was absolutely not the case and took more than a year to produce the yet erroneous document. For deficient information gathering, 3 out of 10. Second category, findings and discussion. Out of the 84 incidents which received complaints about them, only 19 were actually being investigated by the authority. That's bad, but what's worse is that only 2 of them even receive any real discussion in the report. 2 accounts of using pepper spray on February the 10th when they weren't supposed to. This manifests itself as 5 paragraphs of discussion about officer conduct that received complaints in a report just shy of 1,000 paragraphs. Meanwhile, most of the other 82 incidents which raised hackles were hand-waved away as irrelevant or something the IPCA would investigate and discuss with the offended party individually. By contrast, 58 paragraphs are spent discussing and detailing the police's use of tasers, weapons of opportunity, sponge rounds, firearms, etc. on late March the 2nd. These are all things the authority didn't receive any complaints about except by a handful hit by sponge rounds accidentally. The entire report is bloated with masses of information which either has nothing to do with police conduct, or when it does, it's about conduct no one was criticising. For this clown show of deceptive omissions and irrelevant inclusions, 2 out of 10. Lastly, the conclusions and recommendations. We've already covered the final assessment in this episode, so I won't spend long on it, but the protest numbers didn't suddenly swell after February 10th because so many people thought the cops were doing such a bang-up job they just wanted to thank them in person. I also doubt the about 50% uptick in nationwide police resignations for those not working the protest was due to envy of their peers in Wellington knocking it out of the park. That they can write this entire report without condemning a single instance of police behaviour as unacceptable is mind-boggling. Even more staggering is that despite ignoring and hand-waving so much misconduct, the police still come away looking terrible in the details of this report for those that take the time to look, and yet the conclusion is that police did a good job. It very much looks like the conclusion was written first and then the findings filled in after the fact. Moving straight from this into another section that looks like it was pre-ordered, they recommend that police powers be expanded. No one was complaining that police weren't able to exercise even greater powers in opposition to the protesters. They were complaining that police crossed the line of acceptable conduct in regards to the limited powers they already possess. Why then would your recommendation be to expand those powers? The worst of the lot, for their truly idiotic assessment, 1 out of 10. That leaves the IPCA with an overall score of 2 out of 10 for their Convoy 22 protest report. 2 out of 10 is a big fat F for flagrantly fraudulent fabrication. In fact, I think I found a new meaning for the acronym IPCA. It's propaganda, clear as, and sadly the taxpayer funds it. If we get a government worth its salt after the coming election, there should be an assessment of these assessors and some changes to say the least. Now, since the report did such a rubbish job of reviewing the police conduct, I'll do so myself, and it's not going to take me 225 pages. There are clearly strains of political pressure behind the operational decisions the police executed. This is against police policy and for good reason. That's how you get an authoritarian police state where you will get as much freedom as a motorcycle without wheels. There was a suspicious lack of CCTV footage from every source, including the police, who, having admitted this was a groundbreaking event, must have known video record would be important. This is alongside factors such as a failure to fill out the legally required TOR incident reports. In light of the previous point about political pressure, this lack of accountability makes sense but is especially alarming. The failure of law enforcers to apply the law properly on February the 10th was an embarrassing fiasco. This wasn't a random encounter in the street caught without the right legal acumen, it was a planned operation. Compounding this grievance was the gross level of violent misconduct enacted by officers that day. Never issuing an apology for unlawfully assaulting and arresting citizens set a very strained tone between police and protesters for the remainder of the occupation, which for many remains to this day. The lack of an apology was one enormous communications muff-up, but one only eclipsed by the utter failure to organise negotiations with a group of disgruntled dissenters whose primary desire was to be heard. The protesters were hardly trying to storm Parliament, otherwise they would have done that on the first day when they had huge numbers and the police were few. Despite this, the tactic of choice was to deliberately aggravate those assembled. This ultimately bore fruit when on the 2nd of March, after watching their belongings being callously torn up and carted off to be destroyed, after watching pepper spray canisters fired into an encampment containing their children, after being hit with shields and batons and doused in amounts of that acrid aerosol which until the previous day had been illegal by officers who had already donned riot gear, after all that the protesters retaliated with significant violence of their own. Many would even argue that the vast majority of the actual protesters remained peaceful until the very end as they dispersed, and the aggressive antics of the 2nd of March afternoon, so widely paraded by the media and IPCA report itself, were carried out by a separate group. What seems obvious to me is that throughout it all, protesters were not treated like New Zealand citizens, they were treated like an enemy of the state. Despite being a peacefully assembled outcry larger than any in our history, they were not engaged with but belittled, slandered and attacked. The then New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern should have addressed the protesters. She certainly had an easy out when the High Court announced the mandates were in breach of the Bill of Rights. She could have presented herself, remarked that in light of the recent ruling the protesters might have a point, that she'd consider their appeal and sent them on their way, appearing the compassionate captain she'd ever tried to portray herself as. Instead, she chose to pass on that opportunity and set the police on her own people to make a point. I remember there was a previously alien air of caution about the country following the protest dissolution, as if one was worried they might express the wrong opinions. As we head into voting shortly, it's important to remember it wasn't just the PM, but all of the parties currently seated in Parliament. None of them stood up to oppose these actions. It was only a little over a year ago, although it feels like forever, and deliberately so given our frenetic news cycle. It's the same people there now as it was then, and if they seem to have changed their tune, I'm quite sure it's no more than sensing an opportunity to gather more power for themselves. It's not just the establishment politicians, but also the police leadership in our country that requires scrutiny, and we can only hope that we soon see a government that will do just that. I empathise with the difficult position many police officers were put in. Met many good cops while I was at the protest myself, and as I've stated before, want to see the best possible policing return to our country. But the street level officers are not without blame. If they'd refused to abuse their fellow countrymen, their leaders would have been powerless to execute the injustice they planned. In exactly the same way, if all the citizens of our nation had stood up against the division our leaders engendered, they wouldn't have had the power to implement it. There would have been no mandates if the populace hadn't allowed it. I feel for you if you were scared of the virus, but you had a vaccine offered to you to quell those fears. If the failure of somebody else to take that cure rendered it ineffective, then it wasn't a vaccine in any sense that we've traditionally understood, and since that's what was being presented, you can hardly blame the skeptics among us for their hesitation. Anyway, that's yet again another topic for another day. I really hope you enjoyed our series on the IPCA report. Please comment below with feedback and ideas for what topics you'd like me to cover next. A big cheers to all of you that have listened this far to our very rocky first undertaking. Here's to many more in the future.